Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. As you're filtering in, we're just going to give a minute to get everyone in, but you are in the right place. All right, as you're filtering in, we're just welcoming everyone. We're just giving a minute for everyone to get on before I introduce everything. But thank you for coming. Happy to have you guys here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the LSL webinar, Maximizing Transient Occupancy Tax Revenue. Don't leave money on the table. We are happy to have you with us today. Before I introduce our presenter, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so be on the lookout later today for an email containing a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides. This webinar will run for 50 minutes with a 10-minute Q&A immediately following at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions for Ryan, please put them in the Q&A box located in the Zoom toolbar. To find that, hover your mouse over the top or the bottom of your screen and the toolbar will pop up. This webinar is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credit. We will launch 4 polls throughout the presentation. To receive credit, you must answer 3 out of the 4 polling questions and also complete the short evaluation that you will receive afterwards. LSL is using a new CPE system, so please note that the evaluation email will be coming from LC Vista. If you're having trouble seeing the polls, try minimizing the Zoom screen as sometimes the polling questions pop up behind it. You may need to click or drag the Zoom screen around a bit to see them. If you're using multiple screens, check each one as it may pop up on another screen. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Ryan Domino is a partner in LSL's Assurance and Advisory Department and has over 12 years of experience working with government agencies. His primary area of expertise and focus is researching, auditing, and accounting standards, including GASB pronouncements and the Federal Uniform Guidance, and conducting the audits of special districts and mid-sized cities. He also has earned the AICPA's advanced certification for the planning and execution of single audits. Ryan oversees engagements for a variety of governmental clients, providing accounting guidance and other services. Ryan is also going to be a speaker at LSL's GAT update, which is going to be in April on technical topics, and is responsible for overseeing the Government Services Department's annual audit trainings. Okay, Ryan, let's have you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Cami. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to talk about something, a little more practical. I know Cami mentioned that I'm going to be talking about uniform guidance at the GAT update, and it's all very technical stuff, but every once in a while, it's really nice to take a break and talk about something that is, more fun and you can take these practical tools back to your organizations and really, look at that. So it's always fun to do these webinars. Happy to be here today. The next slide is pretty much just my face in case you can't see me on camera, which is, hopefully you can. So I'll skip that and go right to our little disclaimer. You can read the technical stuff if you want, but essentially just want to let you know that this is essentially one man's opinion. This is not authoritative guidance. It should not be treated as such. So please don't put my name in any of your policies and procedures going forward. The idea is just to help you out and not write anything for you. So now that we're past the little disclaimer here, let's kind of dive into the agenda and the learning objectives for the day. So obviously we're going to start, with some story time. This webinar came out of some real life situations that have happened, and I kind of want to share a little bit about that. We're going to discuss why we should care about TOT, why we should monitor it. It's a tax. What's the risk here? Well, you'd be a little surprised. We'll cover not only why you should monitor it and why you should care, but also how you can care and how you can monitor it. We'll go over some best practices with respect to TOT. We'll also discuss the common challenges and issues that often plague TOT operators, of which there are a couple very consistent ones that we've identified over the years. And then, as Cami mentioned, we'll conclude the day with a little bit of a Q&A. So it is my hope and my goal for everyone on this webinar that at the end of this hour, you'll be able to identify risks associated with the collection of TOT and similar revenue sources. And then not only identify those risks, but have tools in your toolbox and learn how best practices can be employed to respond to those risks and make sure that we're not leaving any money on the table. And then we'll also kind of discuss some of the common challenges. So even if you have best practices in place, like knowing what the challenges are and hopefully some tips and tricks on how to overcome them. So without any further ado, it's time for story time with Uncle Ryan here, so to speak. So LSL, as a firm, we probably do about 30 to 40 TOT audits per year. We do a lot of TOT work, not just TOT, but similar engagements as well. So this particular story, this is a real story, happened at one of my clients last year. They're a routine client that they always ask us to do TOT audits. So last year they asked us to audit 20 operators. And so as we were going through it, the city had communicated to us that they discovered that one of their operators had not been paying TOT taxes for a number of years. So that operator obviously was subject to audit in addition to a sample of others. And as we were going through the audits and looking at these operators, we really discovered a trend. And the trend was that there almost every single one of these operators had a finding in some capacity in terms of what they were remitting to the city was being calculated incorrectly. Very common. Almost every single one of them had a finding in some capacity. Obviously, the one operator that wasn't remitting for 3 years had a lot more money owed, and there was a lot more issues there. But even some of the other ones, they owed money in most cases. So of the sample, we looked at probably about a sample of $1 million worth of TOT revenue that had been reported to the city. And what we determined was that of the sampled operators that we looked at, the city had a total recovery of $100,000, which is a huge amount of money when you're looking at the actual sample of TOT revenue that we audited. So the error rate essentially was 10%. So what we ended up doing was extrapolating that error rate of 10% to their total TOT population. And what this really indicated was that the city had possibly over $1 million of TOT that was not being remitted to them, which is not only is that just a high amount of money, but this is a city that is very dependent upon TOT. It's probably one of their number one tax revenue sources. They're in a resort area, and that potential of $1 million not being collected represented about 8%, or 8% of their total. I'm sorry, yeah, 8% of their total TOT revenue. So that's a huge rate of error, essentially, that the city was not collecting on simply because of errors at these operators. The other thing that happened right actually after I prepared these slides, another client of mine reached out to me asking about TOT. I had a conversation with the city manager, and he mentioned that they had a very large hotel operator that, again, had not been remitting TOT for a number of years, and that with penalties and interest, it was over $500,000 worth of revenue that was owed to the city. So as you can see, even in just these two cases, there's potentially a lot of money that's being left on the table. And that's why I wanted to talk about TOT today and come up with some solutions that will hopefully help you all out. So a little bit about me, now that you're interested in the webinar, I'll kind of bore you a little bit about myself. So been working in government for about 13 years. All of that time, auditing, attestation work, financial statement audits, single audits, other compliance audits. But TOT is kind of a fun one for me. As a little fun fact, the very first audit engagement that I ever in charged or ran when I was a staff was a TOT audit. So they have kind of a little bit of a soft spot in my heart, so to speak, about doing these audits and that type of thing, because it's the first thing that I was ever given any level of responsibility for. So little fun fact there. Professional involvement, I'm involved in CSMFO. I've been a speaker at a couple of their trainings over the years, GFOA, Cal CPA, all that good stuff. So I won't bore you any more about me. Let's get back to the fun stuff. You might be sitting in the audience right now thinking, you know what, TOT is not a huge, significant revenue source for my city. This might be an interesting and fun webinar, but it doesn't really apply to me. I would encourage you to think of it in a different way though, because a lot of the principles that you can take from this webinar can apply to other types of revenues for your organization. This includes like franchise fees. If you have a waste management or Republic, waste haulers. Just one example, often those contracts, they're required to remit a percentage of their revenue to the city or organization as a privilege of operating within that jurisdiction. So similar in concept to a TOT. TBID often goes hand in hand with TOT. So if you have any tourism business development improvement districts, this often applies as well. Transient parking taxes is another very common thing that in concept is very similar to TOT. So if you have these types of revenues, maybe they're more significant for you. A lot of the tools that we're going to talk about today would also apply to these types of revenues as well. All right. So I mentioned in my examples, we had some stories to kick it off, but let's talk a little bit first of all, why we should care about TOT, why we should monitor it. So as I was doing some research and some homework for this presentation, what I determined was that TOT often represents a fairly significant portion of revenues for most governments on average. So when you look at the national average, TOT is typically about 5 to 10% of a city's annual revenues. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, 5%, that's not a huge number. It's kind of a drop in the bucket when you compare it to everything else. But, think about it. I would encourage you to think of it from a different perspective. If you had a budget cut of 5 to 10% in your general fund, or if you lost 5% of your revenue, 10% of your revenue, would you be able to make your expenditure budget? Maybe it would become more of a challenge. So even if it's not like a huge amount of money in terms of percentage, it could often be the difference between, what do they call it, austerity measures or something like that, or being able to meet budget. The other thing I found is that the 5 to 10% might be the average nationwide for TOT, but in tourist areas or resort areas, TOT is often significantly higher. The average in these types of areas in California and throughout the country, TOT is typically 30 to 40%. So if you can imagine potentially having an issue with your most major revenue stream, a couple of my clients that are in resort areas, TOT is actually their number one source of revenue, even surpassing property tax. So it can be a major source of revenue. So we should probably take a look at it. TOT is tied to the hotel industry. I'm sure we're all kind of aware of this, transient occupancy tax. So your TOT revenue growth is often it simply is really linked to the growth of the hotel industry revenues. So a little bit of backstory on the history of the hotel revenues. What we've seen since 2013 is that people are traveling more. There's a lot more revenue growth that has happened in the hotel industry. Since 2013, nationwide, hotel industry revenues have actually gone up 28%. Obviously, there was a little bit of a blip or slowdown, if you want to call it that, in 2020 to 2022 when we were going through COVID. But as a whole, the industry has grown significantly over the last decade. And even within the last couple of years since COVID ended, people were like itching to get out and travel again. So even over the last couple of years, hotel industry revenue has gone up significantly. So what that means for all of us as government is that our TOT is also expected to grow as hotel industry revenues grow as well. So I mentioned that as a whole across the country, it's grown 28% over the last 10 years or so. But there are certain regions that are outpacing even the national average. Specifically in California, the top five regions where hotel revenues are growing exponentially is San Diego County, Napa, Wine Country area, Los Angeles County, Orange County, and Coachella Valley. Those are probably the top five places in California that have experienced such fast-paced growth. Even over the past 2 years, when we had the high inflationary growth, these regions actually the hotel revenues exceeded the inflationary growth over the past couple of years, and they're projected to continue to exceed inflationary growth into 2025. So we're seeing a lot of growth in California in particular, as people are traveling here for vacations and stuff like that. So as the hotel industry grows, we would expect TOT to grow as well. So that's the industry that TOT is tied to. But what are some of the risks that we have to deal with as governments, and why we should monitor TOT? The first thing is TOT is a self-reported tax. When you think about it, you're collecting money directly from the taxpayer. This isn't like property taxes where the counties pass it through to the cities, and you kind of would hope that the county is a reputable remitter of the taxes, or the sales tax from the Board of Equalization. I feel like the state government is not gonna they don't have an incentive to not send you everything that's owed to you. But TOT, on the other hand, is reported by the taxpayer themselves. And I don't know about you all, but I did my taxes recently, my federal and state taxes, and of course, as you're going through your personal taxes, there's an incentive to take every deduction and minimize your tax liability. Um, and I'm sure all of us have thought about it at one point. Do I really have to include this little 1099 that has that $1,000 of interest revenue I earned on my savings account? I don't recommend doing that. Report all of your revenue. It's not worth losing your CPA license over. But there's always that little temptation in the back of the mind, right? So just like under reports, so you don't have to pay as much taxes. Well, anytime you're dealing with the taxpayer, there is a risk of that happening. So that's one risk. The other is inconsistent monitoring. So different cities have varying levels of monitoring TOT compliance. So you might have a situation where you might be in the same region, we'll say the Coachella Valley for purposes of example. And let's say your organization is on it. You're like super on the ball, monitoring TOT compliance. Whereas your neighbor next door, same region, they don't really monitor as closely. If I'm a hotel operator and I want to open up a new property in the Coachella Valley, maybe there's a level of incentive to go to the place that is not going to monitor my TOT remittances as much, versus going and opening a hotel in a place that I know I'm going to be a little more scrutinized. So having a more uniform monitoring system across government would probably be good for everybody, because then certain operators and owners of hotels would not necessarily favor certain areas or something like that. The other big thing that everybody I think is dealing with, especially areas that have a lot of resort, tourism, is Airbnb. And I pick on Airbnb simply because they're the first and most common, common, what do they call it? Short-term rental platform. But there's others out there. I don't mean to pick on them specifically, but there has been a trend as people, rent out their homes. They have a vacation home somewhere. They put it on Airbnb, make a little extra money out of it. So, I mean, that's very common. And I don't blame them for it, but a lot of times people do this and they don't realize that they have to have, a TOT, operator's license to actually do that. So they put their home on these platforms and don't have a license. or they do have a license, but then they don't calculate it correctly, or something along those lines, because you're dealing with individuals rather than corporate operators that might not have the same level of expertise. So Airbnb has impacted everyone. Monitoring these types of platforms is difficult in all honesty, but it is a struggle that pretty much every organization is dealing with right now. And then finally, at our corporate operators, our Hilton type, hotels and stuff. Again, not picking on Hilton specifically. I love Hilton. I always stay there when I have to travel. But beside the point, often hotels have frequent turnover in ownership or management circles. It can make things a little bit more complicated. Just as an example, there was a few years ago I did a TOT audit of one hotel, and it was a good clean audit. They did a good job that year and that type of thing. But then we went back and re-audited them in 2 years later, and the entire management had changed over. They got bought out. They had a new owner. They brought in a new management company to run the show, and they had no idea about the stuff we were asking for. So it was kind of interesting that in the prior year audit they had a very clean one, and then in the subsequent year it was kind of a messy audit because they had management change, ownership change, and the systemic knowledge that went along with the organization just didn't go with it. So that's definitely a challenge, and why we should be taking a close look at it. So let's go to our first polling question. I'm kind of curious to see what the results of this are. But what percentage of revenue does TOT represent for your organization's total revenues? Just as a reminder, polling questions sometimes pop up in weird and random places. So you may have to close your certain windows in your browser, see if it popped up behind that. Want to make sure you get full credit today. So try to answer all those polling questions. Okay, so while that's open, I'll continue on. So we talked a little bit about the why. Obviously, there's money out there, and so there's some challenges in monitoring it. But what can we do to really enforce our TOT code and really make sure we're not leaving money on the table? And it really does start with having a solid municipal code. You want to make sure that it's written well, so that way not only is the tax rate in there, as well as interest rates for any sort of late penalties and interest, those types of things. But the code should be specific about what the penalties are and the timing and those types of things. And the penalties themselves, we should really take a look at as well. They should be, I don't want to use the term severe, but for lack of better words, severe enough to discourage violations through fines and penalties. An example would be something like this. I've seen this in a couple of organizations where they just have a simple $500 fine if you don't do your remittances in a timely manner, or fail to remit. It's just a $500 fine. To put it into perspective, I mean, 500 seems like that might be reasonable, but to put it into perspective, let's say I have a short-term rental. I'm a short-term rental guy, and I own a property that I should be remitting $1,000 worth of TOT to the city I live in. Um, but if I don't remit that thousand, I get slapped with a $500 fine. Well, there might be a incentive to just pay the fine rather than the tax. So what I've been seeing some organizations considering is moving to away from a flat dollar fee to a percentage fee. So if you report, gross receipts of X in a certain year, and you don't remit them timely or something like that, you get hit with a penalty of maybe 5-10% of your gross revenues, as opposed to a flat $500 fine. Now, all of a sudden, if my risk of paying a penalty that is, maybe 10% of my $100,000 worth of revenue, so now I'm risking $10,000 versus just paying a $1,000 tax, there's a lot more of an incentive for me to just pay the tax and not incur a penalty. So really looking at our penalty structure, I would encourage you all to do that, making sure that, it does have sufficient incentive for operators to actually pay their taxes, essentially. The other thing your code should have in there is a written provision, basically making it known that the city reserves the right to audit operator books and records on a regular basis or a random basis to identify discrepancies and ensure accuracy. A lot of these are written in there. We just want to make sure that they're written well and it's clear to the operators that they, absolutely have to be on notice that they could be audited, essentially. So once we have a solid code, we have to develop some good procedures. So I like to think of the code as the baseline, and then our procedures are essentially, are what we do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that we're collecting everything. So first thing I'd recommend is developing a tracking system and a reporting system. If you have remittances that come in monthly or quarterly, making sure we're doing this at the time that those remittances come in. So for example, if you have like a Q1 report that comes in, compare your TOT revenues for Q1 this year to Q1 last year. Look for anything that went up, but especially look for things that went down. In both cases that I mentioned before in our example, the cities noticed that TOT took a little bit of a dive in one of the quarters, and that kind of threw the red flag up that, hey, maybe something's missing here, and that's what led to these other items. So having good procedures in place to really track those fluctuations in real time will help you catch operators that are not compliant on a much quicker basis. Another really good procedure that you could implement if you're not doing it already is as remittances come in, you should have a list of license holders that have TOT licenses within your jurisdiction. And as those remittances come in and those tax returns come in, you're kind of checking them off against each other to make sure that everyone who has a license is actually remitting the taxes. And then for those that have not remitted taxes but hold a license, you can follow up with them and see if, are they missing anything? Why haven't they submitted any taxes? The other thing too is I would just encourage you to follow up on indications on lost revenues. A lot of those things that I mentioned just now are great tools to have, but if there's other things that your organization has in place that are working well, that could identify missing revenue, great. But it doesn't mean anything if you're not following up on it. So you could have the best tracking system, you could have the best controls in the world. You could find out, hey, this hotel hasn't paid in 3 years, but if you're not actually reaching out to them to figure it out, that's kind of unhelpful. So make sure we're following up in as quickly a time as possible. Some other things that you might want to put into practice is a policy and a practice for collecting penalties and interest. Oftentimes, there's a great policy, there's a procedure that's in place, but the penalties and interest, even after they're levied, they don't get collected. So this is just kind of a basic accounts receivable follow-up thing. Make sure that you are reconciling your receivables for penalties and interest on a regular basis, and really, following up on that essentially. All right, it looks like the results of the poll came in and got some fairly interesting results in here. So the majority of you, TOT is less than 5%, so about half of you, about less than 5%. The next largest group was 5 to 10%. So kind of an interesting result there. Okay, so once you have a good policy, for collecting penalties and interest, and also, reconciling those balances regularly to make sure that we're actually collecting it. The other thing that would be a great practice to put into place is periodic audits of local operators. A lot of my clients do this. Some do it in-house, some outsource to LSL, for example. There's other companies out there. I think HDL does them too, that do audits of local operators. But I really do strongly encourage you, however which way you decide to go about conducting these periodic audits, that you have a system in place to do it. Your corporate operators, your Best Westerns, your Hiltons, those types of TOT remitters, they really should be audited very routinely. I would encourage you to probably take a look at them, you know, fairly frequently. They should kind of have the expectation that they are going to be audited at some point, just by nature of them being corporate. You know, you think of it in terms of federal income tax. The little individual taxpayer, the chances of being audited very low versus a corporation remitting tax to the federal government, chances of getting audited are very high. So keep, kind of have that mentality when you're picking operators to audit. That being said, your individual operators that are using Airbnb or some other, um, platform, they should at least have this expectation that they might be subject to a random audit. So maybe as you're going through who you're going to look at this year, pick a couple of individual operators at random in addition to a systematic way of looking at the corporate ones. So your corporate operators, just by way of review, they are typically your major sources of revenue. Normally, what we see, as we're going through the TOT audits that our clients ask us to do, these corporate operators often are the lion's share of revenue that the cities generate. So that's one good reason to audit them, because by looking at them, you're gaining a lot of assurance that the majority of your TOT revenue is correct, at least. The corporate operators generally also have a much lower risk of non-compliance. Um, you know, Hilton or Marriott, they're going to have good books and records for you to review and audit, and they're not going to want to risk their brand and their business's reputation for being non-compliant. So, generally speaking, you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And most value for your time, so to speak, by auditing the corporate ones, as opposed to the individuals, for those three reasons. Your individual operators, when you do random audits of them, keep in mind they are minor sources of revenue. You might have an Airbnb property that's, submitting $1,000 a year or some ridiculously small amount. So not only are they small, there's a very high risk of non-compliance because you're dealing with typically individuals that don't, they might not be fully aware, or they didn't read the municipal code or something before they even started doing this. They often don't have accounting backgrounds, so the internal controls in that they should have in place to make sure they're compliant often are not there. And then the other thing too is they are amazing at ghosting us. Uh, I'll tell you from experience, if we reach out to 10 operators on a short-term rental platform, of those 10, less than five typically even respond to the request for audit. And the city's code enforcement typically has to get involved or investigate to make sure they're even, owning that property or something like that. So the response rate for individual operators is often incredibly low, making them very difficult to audit. So you're not going to get a ton of value by spending time auditing the short-term rentals, especially if you audit the hotels and the corporate operators. You'll get a lot more assurance that your revenue is there. So what I would recommend if you're going to start implementing a practice of auditing your operators, probably the best practice that I've seen at a few of my clients is a 3-year cycle. You want to touch all of your corporate operators at least once in a 3-year, and then restart the cycle every 3 years. So your corporate operators, they should have this expectation that at least once within the next 3 years, I'm going to get audited by the city for my TOT remittances. Your individual operators, they should at least have the idea that I'm subject to audit. It could happen, but obviously putting them on a cycle might be a little bit of a challenge. As far as the timing of the audits go, again, we're dealing with businesses and individuals in most cases, so we should be a little strategic about when we decide to do these audits. Often between federal tax deadlines, I found is the best time to do it. Because if they're, trying to get support for an audit that they're getting from the IRS and an audit from you, I hate to break it to everyone, but the IRS typically takes priority. So if you can time it between when the federal tax deadlines are, typically what we see is the response rate goes up and the effectiveness of the audit increases. So when you've completed your audits, a great practice to do to kind of instill a culture in your city amongst the operators of compliance is you want to follow up with the non-compliant ones. It's one thing if I provide you an audit report and I say, hey, this, Super 8 was non-compliant. They owed you X amount of dollars in taxes, but you don't actually follow up with them. It kind of defeats the purpose of that. So make sure you're following up with non-compliant operators. And if they have a corrective action plan in place to make sure it doesn't happen again, work with them to try and make sure that they stay in compliance next time. Um, I would say in most cases, people are trying to do the right thing. I've not come across anything, especially amongst the corporate operators that have findings. It's almost never malicious. It's just, uh, mistakes happen, change in management. I feel like most people try to do the right thing in business, but offering that follow-up and support to make sure they're compliant in the next round is very important. I would also recommend a general communication get sent out to all license holders. So if you audit, 10 operators and there were common findings and shortfalls amongst those 10, just sending a newsletter blast or some sort of communication to the other license holders, kind of just summarizing the results of those audits that happened, highlighting common findings and shortfalls. It kind of will go a long way to encourage operator compliance. Because again, I've mentioned before, I feel like most of the operators are trying to do the right thing. I don't think anyone's necessarily going out to, rip you guys off, but it does happen. But just being communicative about what we found, these were some of the issues. It really would help probably address deficiencies in the other license holders. So with that, let's go to question 2. Does your organization's municipal code allow for periodic audits of operators? And does your organization actually do those audits? Be interested to see these results as well. So let's go on to the common issues. So I mentioned before, especially with your short-term rentals, a low rate of responsiveness. This is a very common problem. I would say if you take a look at the average that LSL does for our audits for our clients, typically the rate of responsiveness is only about 40-50% typically. It's not a high rate of response simply because we're looking at a mix between corporate and individual operators. Um, our corporate operators are almost, I would say, 100% responsive typically. They're usually very good at responding. But when you throw in the individuals doing the short-term rentals, that percentage drops significantly. So getting a low rate of responsiveness is very common. So would not be surprised by that if you go to do an audit of your operators. The other item is inadequate books and records. This is a very common finding. A lot of times the um, records that they provide are limited, especially at the short-term rental level. They just don't have like even a QuickBooks or something like that to keep track of the revenues that they've received and are owed, TOT on. Even the corporate ones, when they change over management, a lot of times things get lost and they have to reach back out because oftentimes these audits happen after the change in management has occurred, but for the period before the change in management. So you might be auditing a previous owner's records with a new management company. So often the support gets lost, and it's just not able to be provided. So that's another very common finding. The third one is allowable exemptions. Most codes that I've seen allow exemptions for like active duty military or other, not short-term rental. So if you're staying for more than 30 days, you're exempt from TOT or something like that. The common finding here is you're going to see a lot of exemptions claimed, and then there just isn't a sufficient documentation. Best example I can think of here is somebody claiming active duty military exemption, but then the hotel or the operator forgot to take a photocopy of their military ID. Obviously, they still claim the exemption from TOT on that room rental, but there's just no evidence to support it. So this is another very common finding. Exclusion of guest charges. This one is frequent. We've seen this at a couple of pretty much every city I've ever done a TOT audit for. When I look at the operators, it's pretty inconsistent across those operators on what they're including as a guest charge. And more often than not, they're excluding things that should be included. So just taking a good look at that, making sure they're capturing all of the taxable revenue on the receipt calculations. That's very important. I mentioned before, just lack of knowledge transfer when turnover happens at the management or ownership level at our corporate operators. And then, finally, our individual operators, they just don't have internal controls. It's often one person doing everything. And even if they're trying to do a good job, oftentimes there's just that second layer of review to catch any errors that might happen. It just doesn't exist. So that's often a very frequent common finding. So I know the polling questions are rapid fire right now as we're kind of coming to the conclusion today, but the results of polling question number 2 are out. And that was, does your code allow for periodic audits, and do you actually do them? So the majority, I'd say a little less than half, about 46% of you say that you have a code that allows for it, and you actually do them. So that's awesome. Keep it up. And then about a third say you have a code that allows for it, but the audits don't actually happen. And then the remaining 18% are a double no. So interesting. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and do yet another polling question before we get into the challenges. Have you ever identified fraudulent TOT returns or remittances? This one I'm definitely very curious about. So while that's going on, we'll kind of resume here. This is actually the last slide. So just some challenges I mentioned to effective monitoring of TOT. I think probably the biggest one, just based on discussions I've had with a number of clients and organizations over the last couple of years, is really just timing and resources. I know with the end of the COVID era, and even during that, people really started rethinking their career paths. And so just finding qualified people that want to do government finance work, a little bit of a challenge lately. And it's been a pain point for probably everybody at some point in the last 5 years. So definitely not insensitive to that. But if it's something that your city really values, having effective controls and monitoring over TOT, I mentioned before, there's a number of great resources and companies, shameless plug, LSL included, that do monitor. You can outsource the monitoring function to. But if it's, something that's important and you have the staff to do it, obviously make sure we're allocating the appropriate time and resources to checking this. The other biggest challenge is just an incomplete record of operators. Knowing who is supposed to be remitting TOT to you versus who actually is. Often just this is a major challenge. You don't know who's out there versus who should be sending you stuff. And in all honesty, I don't know if there is really an answer to this. I mean, you're always going to have, short-term rental operators operating without licenses. I don't know how to overcome that outside of constant communication and making it very publicly known that you're not supposed to do that. But that's going to be a perpetual challenge. So obviously reconciling the license holders against remitters, I mentioned that earlier as um, a tool you can use to make sure you're collecting everything. And then also maybe just having some policies that are created and enforced for short-term rentals, making sure that they are licensed to operate and they're not operating without a license. Again, that's going to be a challenge, but I mean, we can do the best we can and communicate, what the policies are in our jurisdictions and try to enforce where we can. So those are the challenges. At this point, we're going to go to Q&A, but before we do that, um, about 17%, so we have 156 poll respondents, and 26 of you have identified intentionally fraudulent TOT returns or remittances. So it's a pretty good percentage. Was not expecting something about that high, but good to know. All right, so with that, let's go to the Q&A. As a reminder, the Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A section in Zoom. I don't see the chat, so I do see the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and answer them in the order in which they came in here. First question was, how much decline in business travel offsets the tourism growth? Um, that's kind of a good question. I'll be completely honest. I didn't dive into the details of the difference between business travel versus tourism. I kind of just looked at the growth of hotel revenue as a whole for the purposes of this webinar. So I don't quite have the answer for you, but as I mentioned before, the growth across the board in hotel revenue has been about 28% over the past decade. So sorry, I don't have the individual details of that. Next question that came in is, do I recommend that cities try to communicate with Airbnbs to remit TOT taxes? Yes, I absolutely do recommend having a certain communication process, not only with the operators, but I've even had some organizations reach out to Airbnb and these other platforms to try and inform them about the situation, the individual code requirements, things like that. Just making sure that everybody's on the same page about what's supposed to be done. But yeah, communication with the individual operators can definitely be a little bit of a challenge in my experience. They tend to not reply, but definitely try. Do what we can do our best. Okay, the next question is, let's see. How do you handle the statute of limitations for TOT? Do you have properties sign waivers of prescription to hold the review period open? If so, how do you handle a property that is refusing to sign the waiver? This is one of those things that, generally speaking, it's on a case by case basis. A lot of cities have things in their code or policies where there's not really a limitation on it. A lot of them just say like, hey, we'll come and audit you, once a year, and they look at the prior fiscal year or something like that. Um, in my capacity, generally speaking, I don't. Um, a lot of the clients that I do this for, I'm also the independent auditor for. So there's a line of limitation where I can't tell them to do X, Y, and Z because it's becoming making a management decision. I would recommend that for properties that are refusing to sign the waiver, maybe reach out to your city attorney, legal counsel, and see what their thoughts on the matter are. I would also probably recommend that same exact thing for waivers to hold the period of statute of limitations open. So probably not the best answer I could give outside of consult your attorney, but that's probably the best advice I will give you at that one. Okay, the next one is a lien on property. Have you ever advised or had a client place a lien on a property for lack of payment? Yes, yes, I have. That is honestly the best practice that you can probably go for is, if they're not responsive to the audit, if they're not responsive to fees and penalties and interest and stuff like that for lack of payment or something along those lines. Yes, absolutely would recommend placing the lien. That's probably the best course of action to make sure you do end up collecting that money. Does LSL have a tracking system worksheet that can be used? Um, that we do not. What I can probably mention is that one of my other clients, they have, and they have it for TOT and transient parking taxes. They have basically a list of operators, and then they just have years. So it's like a matrix, if you will, that has the name of the operator and the address. And then they have, fiscal year this, fiscal year that, fiscal year this. And so basically they just have it in 3-year cycles, and then they just checkbox and making sure that each operator is being hit at least once. So that would be probably the best answer I have for you. That, do we have a tracking system worksheet? No, but I can kind of explain what some other clients have done. Okay, so the next question is, should the audit be developed by city staff or a CPA firm? Usually because cities are short in staff and audits are costly. Um, so the procedures and the audit, I've seen it go both ways. Most of the time, though, the consultant, the CPA firm, is the one who develops the procedures that they're going to do. And then they will provide it to management of the city staff, making sure that they believe that the procedures are adequate for what they are trying to do. And then upon that agreement, the CPA typically will do the audit. Some other cities that do their own TOT work often have their own procedures that they develop. So if you're outsourcing it, you can have your consultant put together the procedures for your approval. Or if it's something that you've traditionally done in-house and want to start outsourcing, you can use the procedures that you've done in the past to make sure your consultant follows that. There is a cost benefit. I will definitely agree to that. You know, you have to kind of weigh that out. If you have a tremendous amount of TOT revenue that comes in, and historically, when you have checked it, there are errors. There might be a benefit to incur that cost to recover. I would say, in my experience, the cost of the audit typically breaks at least even with the amount of recovery. I've seen this at a number of places. But historically, if you have good operators that are responsive and do a good job, you might be incurring a cost for a minimal benefit outside of peace of mind that you're getting, everything that's owed to you. So I can't tell you the exact cost benefit, but look at your situation, and if you have remitters that are late and stuff like that, there will probably be a benefit to hire somebody or to do the audit, and make sure that they're not causing problems in other areas as well. Okay, good question here. When auditing Airbnb, do they provide itemized transactions for sample selection? Often, no. That is kind of the problem with Airbnb. When we've seen it in the past, it's often just a total summary. So we can't always dive down into the detail to get um, to get into whether or not everything that's being captured for TOT is appropriate, or if things are being excluded. That's often probably the biggest challenge. And we do get documentation from the short-term rental platforms. It's just not sufficiently detailed to actually sample transactions for testing. Okay, let's see. Next questions. Do
Hey,
you recommend having?
Ryan. I
Yes.
also don't want to forget about our last polling question, so I think we
Oh,
should
yeah.
launch that, and then you can answer some of the rest of them as that's getting answered. So I'm going to
Yes,
launch
thank
that
you.
right
I almost forgot about that. Go ahead and launch that, please.
now. Yep.
So while that's open, I'll answer these last couple of questions here. Do you recommend having TOT operators submit monthly revenue statements with their remittance? The issue right now is how do we know without auditing each month that they are submitting the correct numbers? That's that would actually be a great thing to do. The only question there is a lot of that information is fairly confidential accounting records, so you're probably going to get a lot of resistance if you wanted to have them submit those records. It might be one of those things where if your code allows for an audit, this could be you could at least back your position by saying, hey, our code allows for an audit. We need you to submit these revenue statements along with the remittance, so that way we can check your work. If your code doesn't necessarily allow for that, and it's written in a way that maybe it would be questionable, you could probably get a lot of pushback there. So I like the idea. I think it's a great control. There just might be um, you'll definitely have resistance, and there may be some legality issues on that. So just keep those in mind. All right. The next question is there some sort of perceived adversarial relationship that you need to be sensitive with the hotel operator so as not to cause friction? Yes, absolutely. Particularly for, operators that are probably a major source of revenue. Um, just as a short story, there was a situation with one of my other clients. They had a good relationship with a major remitter, um, and that remitter did not really pass the audit. They had issues with their books and records and responsiveness. Even though historically they were good, they had some problems in the year that we were auditing. So even though they had findings, the city, in that case, in the spirit of maintaining a good relationship because of where they stand in the community and stuff like that, um, they waived the penalties and those types of things, um, and then basically just told them like, hey, we're going to waive it this time. You are going to be audited again next year, so we're going to give you time to clean up the issue, and then kind of go from there. So yes, you do want to be sensitive to having an adversarial relationship, especially with organizations that are a key source of revenue for your city. But at the same time, you have to also enforce your code and stuff like that. So case by case basis. But yeah, try to balance enforcement with maintaining good relationships. All right, so I think that is all the time we have for the day. So just as a close, the polling question number 4, there was the majority said we could do better, but we're on the right track, which is awesome to hear. And then, another third of you mentioned that we're doing a good job. So it sounds like the majority are doing a great job tracking your TOT assessments and monitoring. So I'm very happy to hear that. For those of you who say that the 18% that you guys need to improve a little bit, my email is on this invite, and contact me online through the website or whatever. I'd be happy to discuss further with you. So in closing, I really appreciate your time and attention today. It was a pleasure and a delight to present, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all for coming.